Number 1. Bernie Madoff, the man who ran the biggest financial fraud in human history. The name Bernard Lawrence Madoff is one that tens of thousands of people around the world cannot hear without feeling a deep and lasting sense of loss, because this one man, operating out of a seemingly legitimate office on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building in Midtown Manhattan, New York City, constructed and maintained for decades what investigators and federal prosecutors would later confirm to be the single largest investment fraud in the entire history of the United States of America. A scheme so vast in its scale and so long-running in its operation that even after years of investigation, courtroom proceedings, and the work of dozens of federal agents, the full dimensions of what Madoff had done were almost impossible to fully comprehend. Bernie Madoff was born on April 29, 1938, in the Queens borough of New York City, the son of Ralph and Sylvia Madoff, and he grew up in a household that was not wealthy but was deeply connected to the world of finance and business. And from his earliest years he demonstrated an intense interest in money, markets, and the mechanics of how wealth was built and managed. He attended Far Rockaway High School in Queens, where he was remembered by classmates as ambitious and socially confident, and he went on to study at the University of Alabama before transferring to Hofstra University on Long Island, where he earned a degree in political science in 1960, and he briefly enrolled in Brooklyn Law School before abandoning that path entirely to focus on something he believed he could do better than almost anyone else on Wall Street, which was manage money and generate returns for investors. In 1960, using $5,000 he had saved from working as a lifeguard and installing garden sprinkler systems during his college years, Madoff founded a small investment firm he called Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, and in those early years the firm operated legitimately as a penny stock trader and market maker, meaning it facilitated the buying and selling of stocks between buyers and sellers without being directly listed on major exchanges, and Madoff was genuinely talented at this work, genuinely skilled at understanding how markets moved and how technology could be used to give traders an edge, and he was in fact one of the early pioneers of electronic trading on Wall Street, playing a key role in the creation of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, which would go on to become one of the most important financial markets in the world. His reputation grew steadily throughout the 1960s and 1970s, and so did his firm, and so did the circle of wealthy individuals and institutions who trusted him with their money, drawn in by the combination of his extraordinary reputation, his quiet confidence, the social exclusivity he cultivated around his investment advisory business, and the remarkably steady and attractive returns he claimed to be generating for his clients year after year regardless of what the broader markets were doing, which in hindsight should have been one of the clearest warning signs imaginable but which at the time simply reinforced the idea that Madoff was somehow smarter than everyone else, somehow more capable than every other money manager on the street, somehow possessed of a secret method or a special insight that allowed him to produce consistent profits even when the economy was struggling and other investors were suffering losses. What very few people knew, and what would not be confirmed until the catastrophic unraveling of December 2008, was that the investment advisory side of Madoff's business was not generating those returns at all, was not investing client money in any meaningful way, was in fact operating as a classic Ponzi scheme in which the money paid to existing investors as supposed profits and returns was simply coming from the deposits made by newer investors, with no actual investment activity taking place, no actual securities being purchased, no actual market strategy being executed, just a continuous cycle of money moving from new accounts to old accounts while Madoff and his associates generated false account statements, fabricated trade records, and created an elaborate paper fiction of a thriving investment portfolio that existed only in the documents his office produced and nowhere else in the real world. The exact date on which the legitimate side of Madoff's business gave way entirely to the fraudulent side has never been precisely established, with some investigators believing the Ponzi scheme began in the early 1970s and others placing its origins as late as the early 1990s. But what is clear is that by the time federal agents finally moved in, the scheme had been running for at minimum 17 years and possibly as long as 4 decades, making it not just the largest but also almost certainly the longest-running investment fraud in American history. Madoff built his client base with extraordinary care and deliberate exclusivity, cultivating a reputation as someone whose investment fund was difficult to get into, whose doors were not open to just anyone, and this strategy of manufactured scarcity made wealthy individuals and institutions actually compete for the privilege of giving him their money, with friends recommending friends, business associates vouching for other business associates, charitable foundations and pension funds, and University endowments all lining up to place their assets under Madoff's management because the sense of being admitted to something special and exclusive was itself a powerful psychological hook that kept people from asking too many questions about how exactly those consistent returns were being generated. Among his clients were some of the most prominent names in American business, entertainment, and philanthropy, including film director Steven Spielberg, actors Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick, broadcaster Larry King, and Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, who along with his wife Marion had entrusted Madoff with their entire life savings of $12 million as well as $15 million belonging to their nonprofit organization the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity, meaning that a single man's fraud did not just destroy the Wiesel's personal financial security but also crippled a foundation dedicated to the memory of Holocaust victims and to the promotion of human dignity around the world. But while the celebrity names attracted the most media attention when the scheme finally collapsed, the more devastating human story was found among the thousands of ordinary, non-famous people who had given Madoff their retirement savings, their college funds, their life's work, often on the recommendation of a trusted friend or family member who was themselves a victim, and who woke up one morning in December 2008 to discover that everything they thought they had saved and invested and secured for their futures was simply gone. The collapse came in December of that year because the global financial crisis that had been building throughout 2008 reached a point where a large number of Madoff's clients, facing their own financial pressures from the broader market downturn, began requesting withdrawals from their accounts totaling approximately $7 billion, and Madoff, whose scheme depended entirely on a continuous flow of new money coming in to pay the withdrawals of existing clients, simply did not have that money available because it had long since been spent or transferred, and with no legitimate investment portfolio to liquidate, he had nothing to give them. On December 10, 2008, Madoff confessed to his sons Mark and Andrew that the investment advisory business was, in his own words, one big lie, and his sons, who have consistently maintained they had no prior knowledge of their father's crimes, reported him to federal authorities the following morning, and on December 11, 2008, federal agents arrested Bernard Madoff at his Manhattan apartment, ending a fraud that had touched virtually every corner of the financial world. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in the history of white-collar crime, with nearly 15 FBI special agents leading the effort alongside law enforcement partners and financial analysts, and what they uncovered was almost beyond comprehension, with prosecutors ultimately estimating that the total fictitious account balances shown to clients amounted to approximately $64 to $65 billion, though the actual cash that had flowed into the scheme from real investors over the years was estimated at somewhere between $17 and $20 billion, the rest being decades of fabricated paper gains that had never existed in any real sense but which clients had believed in completely and had built their financial plans around. In March 2009, Bernard Madoff appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies including securities fraud, investment advisor fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and making false statements, and Judge Denny Chin, rejecting the defense's argument that a sentence of 12 years would be sufficient, imposed the maximum possible sentence of 150 years in federal prison, a sentence that was widely seen not just as a punishment for Madoff personally but as a statement about the severity of what he had done and the breadth of the suffering he had caused. At least 2 of his ruined clients took their own lives in the aftermath of the scheme's collapse, including Thierry de la Villehutchet, a French aristocrat and fund manager who had lost $1.4 billion of his clients' money in the fraud and was found in his Manhattan office. Among those who survived but were forever changed were the members of Madoff's own family, including his wife Ruth, whose life was described by observers as completely destroyed by the revelation, his brother Peter, who pleaded guilty to his own role in the firm and spent nearly a decade in prison, and his 2 sons Mark and Andrew, both of whom the scheme devastated in different ways, with Mark Madoff dying by suicide on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest, and Andrew Madoff dying of cancer in September 2014, with those who knew him saying he never recovered from the psychological weight of his father's betrayal and the public disgrace that followed. The United States Department of Justice established the Madoff Victim Fund to distribute recovered assets to those who had lost money, and across 10 rounds of payments totaling approximately $4.3 billion distributed to more than 40,800 victims in 127 countries, the fund eventually succeeded in compensating victims for nearly 94% of their confirmed losses, which represents an extraordinary achievement in asset recovery but which does nothing to restore the years of anxiety, the broken retirements, the devastated charitable missions, and the profound sense of personal betrayal that tens of thousands of people carried with them long after the last check was written. Bernard Lawrence Madoff died on April 14, 2021, at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina, of natural causes at the age of 82. Having served just over 12 years of his 150-year sentence, and there were very few people in the world, including members of his own surviving family, who mourned his passing, because the legacy he left behind was not one of financial innovation or Wall Street achievement but one of the most comprehensive and prolonged betrayals of human trust that the modern financial world has ever witnessed. Number 2. Elizabeth Holmes, the Silicon Valley visionary who put patient lives at risk. Elizabeth Holmes was, for a brief and dazzling period in the early years of the 21st century, celebrated as one of the most extraordinary entrepreneurial minds that Silicon Valley had ever produced, a young woman who had dropped out of Stanford University at the age of 19 to found a company she called Theranos, which she promised would revolutionize the entire field of medical diagnostics by making it possible to test a patient for hundreds of different diseases and medical conditions using nothing more than a single tiny drop of blood taken from the tip of a finger, a technology that she insisted was not only real but already working, already being used in real clinical settings, already changing the lives of real patients, and which she promoted with such extraordinary confidence and such carefully crafted personal charisma that some of the most experienced investors, business leaders, and public figures in the United States handed her hundreds of millions of dollars and joined the board of her company without ever independently verifying whether the technology she described actually existed and actually worked the way she claimed it did. Holmes was born on February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C., into a family with a background in government and public service, and she showed from her earliest years an intense ambition and a powerful desire to be remembered as someone who changed the world, telling those close to her that she wanted to be a billionaire and that she intended to build something transformative, something that would put her name alongside the greatest innovators in history. She enrolled at Stanford University School of Engineering in 2002 and was accepted into a prestigious program that allowed undergraduate students to work directly in a research laboratory, and it was there that she began developing the ideas that would eventually become Theranos, convinced that the existing model of medical blood testing, which required patients to go to specialized laboratories and submit large vials of blood drawn from a vein by a trained phlebotomist, was unnecessarily cumbersome, expensive, and inaccessible, and that a device capable of running comprehensive diagnostic panels from a single fingertip drop of blood could democratize healthcare in a fundamental and lasting way. In 2003, at the age of 19, she withdrew from Stanford and used the tuition money her parents had saved to fund the earliest stages of what would become Theranos. And over the following years she built the company with a relentless, almost obsessive focus, projecting at all times the image of an unstoppable visionary, adopting a carefully constructed personal style that included an unchanging uniform of black turtleneck sweaters deliberately evocative of Steve Jobs, cultivating an unnaturally deep-speaking voice that she used consistently in public appearances and interviews, and surrounding herself with a board of directors whose names alone conferred enormous credibility on the enterprise, including former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and a collection of other former government officials and business luminaries who had been persuaded by Holmes's presentation and her promises that Theranos was on the verge of transforming medicine. What those board members did not know, and what Holmes and her former romantic partner and company president Ramesh Sunny Balwani worked systematically to prevent anyone from discovering, was that the core technology Holmes had been promising investors and the public for years simply did not work the way she described. That Theranos proprietary blood testing device, which the company called the Edison, was fundamentally incapable of running the comprehensive and accurate diagnostic panels. Holmes advertised that the company was in fact using conventional third-party blood testing machines from companies like Siemens to process many of its tests while falsely presenting the results as having been generated by Theranos' own revolutionary technology, and that the test results being sent to real patients with real medical conditions were in many cases dangerously inaccurate, because Theranos was using such tiny sample volumes and such unreliable equipment that the margin of error in its results was far beyond anything that would be considered medically acceptable. Investors poured approximately $945 million into Theranos based on Holmes's representations about the company's technology, and its financial health, representations that federal prosecutors would later prove were systematically false, and at the height of the company's perceived valuation, which reached as high as $9 billion, Holmes herself was celebrated on magazine covers and in breathless profiles as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire, a distinction that was itself built entirely on the false foundation of the fraud she was perpetrating. But the human cost of what Holmes did extended far beyond the financial losses suffered by wealthy investors, because real patients with serious medical conditions were receiving blood test results generated by Theranos' unreliable technology and making real medical decisions based on those results. And among the documented cases of patient harm that emerged during the investigation was a woman whose medication was adjusted based on an inaccurate Theranos test result. A pregnant woman whose prenatal monitoring was compromised by faulty data, patients being screened for cancer who received results that could not be trusted, and most devastatingly, at least one patient who was falsely told by a Theranos test result that she carried the precursor virus to AIDS, a finding that caused that person profound psychological anguish and fear before it was eventually determined to be wrong. The company itself ultimately acknowledged that a patient impact existed for every single test that had been run on its analyzer, and it voided all of those tests, an admission of comprehensive failure that came far too late for the patients who had already suffered the consequences. The exposure of Theranos began in earnest in 2015, when Wall Street Journal investigative reporter John Carreyrou published a series of detailed articles based on information provided by whistleblowers inside the company, including Tyler Shultz, the grandson of board member George Shultz, who had become so troubled by what he witnessed inside Theranos that he risked his career and his relationship with his family to bring the truth to light, and whose father Alex Shultz told the court during sentencing proceedings that his son had slept with a knife under his pillow during the period when he suspected he was being followed by Theranos private security operatives. Federal criminal charges were filed against Holmes and Balwani in June 2018, and after years of legal proceedings, Holmes was convicted in January 2022 on 4 counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud related to her deception of investors, and in November 2022 Judge Edward Davila sentenced her to 135 months in federal prison, which is 11 years and 3 months, along with a restitution order of $452 million to be paid. Jointly with Balwani, who was convicted separately in July 2022 and sentenced to 155 months, nearly 13 years in federal prison. Holmes reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Bryan, Texas, on May 30, 2023, to begin serving her sentence, and though her projected release date has been adjusted to reflect good conduct time, she remains incarcerated as of the time of this narration, the most high-profile technology executive in modern American history to be sent to federal prison, a fall from grace that stands as one of the most dramatic in the annals of Silicon Valley, and a case that raised profound and still unresolved questions about how a single charismatic individual was able to persuade so many experienced, sophisticated people to believe in something so thoroughly unreal for so many years. Number 3. Lou Pearlman, the music mogul who stole from elderly investors and his own artists. Lou Pearlman was, in the popular imagination of the 1990s, a visionary figure in the American music industry, the man credited with creating the boy band phenomenon that dominated pop culture for the better part of a decade, the impresario behind the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and a string of other successful acts who collectively sold hundreds of millions of albums and filled arenas around the world. And in the Orlando, Florida entertainment community where he built his empire, he was celebrated as a larger-than-life success story, a big personality with big ideas and an apparently inexhaustible supply of both money and ambition, and almost nobody who celebrated him or worked with him or handed him their savings understood that beneath the glittering surface of his music empire lay one of the most prolonged and cynically constructed financial frauds that the state of Florida, and indeed the entire United States, had ever seen. Louis J. Pearlman was born on June 19, 1954, in the Flushing neighborhood of Queens, New York, and as a child and teenager he was reportedly fascinated by aviation, spending time near airports and developing an obsession with aircraft that would later become the foundation of the fictional companies he used to defraud investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars. He was a cousin of Art Garfunkel of Simon and Garfunkel, a family connection he reportedly leveraged socially throughout his life, and after leaving New York he eventually settled in Orlando, Florida, where he began building a business empire that at various times involved Real Aviation Ventures, talent management, and a sprawling web of subsidiary companies of varying degrees of legitimacy. In the early 1980s, long before he discovered the music industry, Pearlman began soliciting money from private investors for what he described as an employee investment savings account program affiliated with his transcontinental airlines companies, promising investors that their money was federally insured and would generate steady, reliable returns, and the investors who gave him their money, many of them ordinary working people, retirees, elderly individuals living on fixed incomes, friends, family members, and members of his local community who trusted him personally, had absolutely no way of knowing that the companies underpinning these investment promises were largely fictional, that the airline business he described was built on a foundation of fabricated documents and fake financial statements, and that the money they were giving him was not being invested in anything at all but was instead flowing directly into Pearlman's personal accounts to fund the lavish lifestyle he had always craved. The scheme had already been running for years when Pearlman pivoted to the music industry in the early 1990s, reportedly after watching the enormous success of New Kids on the Block and deciding that he could replicate and even surpass it. And in 1993 he held a talent search in the Orlando area that ultimately produced the quintet that would become the Backstreet Boys, 5 young men whose extraordinary vocal talents and Pearlman's promotional instincts combined to create one of the best-selling musical acts in the history of popular music. The success of the Backstreet Boys was followed almost immediately by the creation of NSYNC, which launched the career of Justin Timberlake and went on to achieve comparable global success, and Pearlman became the most powerful boy band manager in the world, a position that gave him enormous social credibility and made his investment fraud significantly easier to perpetrate because potential investors who might otherwise have asked hard questions about his business dealings were reassured by the visible, tangible success of his music empire, not understanding that the legitimate music business and the fraudulent investment scheme were 2 entirely separate operations that Pearlman ran in parallel, using the glamour and celebrity of one to provide cover for the criminality of the other. The artists who worked with Pearlman were themselves victims of his dishonesty in a different but deeply damaging way, as the contracts he offered his young performers were structured in ways that kept the vast majority of the wealth generated by their music in Pearlman's hands rather than their own, with multiple acts including the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC eventually filing lawsuits against him after discovering the financial terms under which they had been operating, and Pearlman was ultimately sued by virtually every act he had ever managed as the full extent of his various deceptions became clear. Meanwhile, the investment fraud continued to grow, with Pearlman spending roughly 20 years convincing approximately 1,700 private investors to place a combined total of somewhere between $300 million and $500 million into his fictional savings program. And when Florida regulators finally began investigating and the scheme was uncovered in 2006, the human devastation was immediate and profound. One elderly woman testified at Pearlman's sentencing that she had lost half of her entire retirement savings and was now living solely on Social Security payments. A widow described her 87-year-old husband breaking down completely in tears when he learned that the money they had so carefully saved over decades of working life had been taken from them. Pearlman was charged in 2007 with conspiracy, money laundering, and making false claims in a bankruptcy proceeding, and in March 2008 he pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, with Judge G. Kendall Sharp specifically stating at sentencing that the length of the sentence reflected the sheer number of lives that Pearlman had damaged and the complete absence of remorse he appeared to feel for what he had done. More than $400 million of the money taken in Pearlman's scheme has never been recovered, meaning that the vast majority of his victims, including those elderly retirees who gave him their life savings and those young musicians who gave him their early careers, never saw their money returned. Lou Pearlman died in federal custody on August 19, 2016, at the age of 62, having served 8 years of his 25-year sentence, and his death in prison brought to a close a story that had begun with genuine musical creativity and ended in one of the most sweeping financial betrayals of ordinary people that the American entertainment industry has ever produced. Number 4. Anna Sorokin, the fake German heiress who conquered New York. The story of Anna Sorokin is in many ways a story about the particular vulnerabilities of a specific time and place, specifically New York City in the middle years of the 2010s, a moment when social media had created entirely new frameworks for establishing credibility and social status, when the display of wealth and exclusivity on Instagram and other platforms had become a form of currency in its own right, and when the circles of high-end hospitality, finance, and arts patronage that Sorokin targeted were populated by people whose professional instincts toward due diligence were routinely overwhelmed by their social instincts toward inclusion and the fear of being seen as insufficiently sophisticated or worldly to recognize genuine wealth when it presented itself at their door. Anna Sorokin was born on January 23, 1991, in Domodedovo, Russia, and moved with her family to Germany as a teenager when her father, a former truck driver who later ran a heating and cooling business, relocated there for work, and it was in Germany that Sorokin first began experimenting with the construction of an alternative identity, eventually reinventing herself completely as Anna Delvey, a name that suggested European aristocracy and old money, and moving to New York City where she set about inserting herself into the uppermost layers of Manhattan social life with a boldness and a shamelessness that even seasoned observers of New York's status-obsessed culture found genuinely astonishing in retrospect. The false identity Sorokin constructed for herself was built on a single foundational claim, namely that she was a wealthy German heiress who had a trust fund worth approximately 67 million euros, money that was held overseas and would be available to her shortly, and she used this claim with such consistency and such apparent casual confidence, dropping references to her fortune not as a boast but simply as a background fact of her existence, that the bankers, lawyers, hotel managers, artists, and socialites she encountered accepted it without serious question, because she behaved in every way as someone who had always had access to vast wealth, staying in the finest hotels in New York and around the world, ordering from the most expensive menus without looking at prices, traveling by private jet, and presenting herself at all times as someone for whom money was simply not a concern worth discussing. The scale of what she managed to accomplish through sheer audacity is remarkable even now, with Sorokin successfully living for extended periods at some of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels including the Beekman, the W New York Downtown, and the Pierre, running up bills of tens of thousands of dollars that she then evaded paying through a combination of promises, deflections, and the simple act of moving on to the next hotel before the previous one could catch up with her. And she also attempted to secure a $22 million bank loan to fund an exclusive private arts club she planned to open under the Anna Delvey Foundation name, going so far as to produce an elaborate 80-page proposal complete with the names of world-renowned artists and architects, a project that she came remarkably close to actually pulling off before the loan application was ultimately rejected. Among the people most directly harmed by Sorokin's scheme were her close personal friends and associates who trusted her and who paid for things on her behalf under the belief that she would reimburse them from her vast fortune, including Rachel Deloach Williams, a photo editor at Vanity Fair who accompanied Sorokin on a lavish trip to Morocco and ended up covering tens of thousands of dollars in expenses on her personal credit card after Sorokin's cards were repeatedly declined. Money that Williams only partially recovered after a prolonged and deeply distressing effort, and art collector Michael Huang who paid for Sorokin's international flights and hotel accommodations for an art viewing trip to Venice and was similarly left with nothing when Sorokin disappeared without repaying him. Sorokin was arrested in October 2017 and her trial, which took place in the spring of 2019 in a New York State Supreme Court courtroom, became a media sensation partly because of the defendant's behavior, as she arrived each day in carefully chosen designer outfits and appeared far more concerned with her appearance and the impression she was making on observers than with the gravity of the criminal proceedings against her, behavior that prosecutors noted in their arguments to the jury as evidence of her fundamental disregard for the people she had harmed. Judge Diane Kiesel, who presided over the case, stated at sentencing that she was stunned by the depth of the defendant's deception, and in May 2019 she sentenced Sorokin to between 4 and 12 years in New York State Prison, also ordering her to pay restitution of approximately $199,000 and fines of $24,000. Sorokin was released on parole in February 2021 after serving approximately 2 years, was subsequently detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement due to her immigration status as a Russian national who had overstayed her visa, and was released again in October 2022 on $10,000 bail with conditions including restrictions on her movement and at various points a prohibition on social media use. And her story was subsequently dramatized in the Netflix series Inventing Anna, produced by Shonda Rhimes, a production that brought her global notoriety and which Sorokin herself has been publicly ambivalent about, suggesting in interviews that the portrayal did not fully capture the person she believes herself to be, a statement that many of those she defrauded have found deeply difficult to hear. Number 5. Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street who stole the savings of ordinary Americans. Jordan Ross Belfort was born on July 9, 1962, in Queens, New York, and grew up in a middle-class household in Bayside with parents who were accountants, and from his earliest years he demonstrated an intense desire to be wealthy, a hunger for financial success that he has described in his own writings and public statements as the defining motivation of his life from the time he was a young man. And while ambition of that kind is not unusual, what set Belfort apart was his willingness to pursue it through means that caused direct and lasting financial harm to thousands of people who had done nothing more than trust a stockbroker they believed was working in their interests. Belfort got his start in the financial industry in the mid-1980s, working at various brokerage firms on Wall Street and developing an understanding of the mechanics of stock trading and investor psychology that he would later weaponize with devastating effectiveness. And in 1989 he co-founded a brokerage firm on Long Island, New York called Stratton Oakmont, which would become within a few years one of the most notorious boiler room operations in the history of American financial crime, a place where hundreds of young brokers trained by Belfort himself used aggressive, manipulative, and often outright fraudulent sales tactics to convince ordinary investors to pour their money into penny stocks that Belfort and his associates had quietly accumulated at very low prices, driving up those stocks' prices through the artificial excitement generated by the sales calls, and then selling their own shares at the inflated price while the ordinary investors who had bought in on their recommendation were left holding worthless paper as the stock collapsed. This practice, known as a pump-and-dump scheme, is straightforwardly illegal, and Belfort knew it was illegal while he was doing it, but the money flowing into Stratton Oakmont was so extraordinary, reaching at its peak an estimated $50 million per month in commissions and trading profits, that Belfort and his team simply continued, funding a lifestyle that by any measure was almost incomprehensibly excessive, with Belfort purchasing multiple luxury homes, a 170-foot yacht he named Naomi after his second wife, a fleet of exotic cars, a helicopter, and sustaining a serious addiction to quaaludes and cocaine that he has openly described in his memoir and public appearances as having been so severe that he functioned at times in a state of near-total impairment while continuing to run a firm that was actively defrauding thousands of people. In total, Stratton Oakmont is estimated to have defrauded more than 1,500 individual investors out of approximately $200 million over the course of its operation, with victims ranging across the United States, ordinary working people who had saved carefully and trusted a stockbroker's promises, only to discover that the investments they had been sold were part of an elaborate manipulation scheme in which they were never intended to profit. One investor who spoke publicly about the experience lost more than $100,000. Another lost $800,000 and later expressed deep frustration at the way the Hollywood film adaptation of Belfort's story, Martin Scorsese's 2013 film The Wolf of Wall Street starring Leonardo DiCaprio, treated the crimes as entertaining material without giving adequate weight to the suffering of those who had been financially destroyed by them. The Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI had been investigating Stratton Oakmont for years when the full scope of the fraud was finally exposed, and in 1999 Belfort agreed to plead guilty to securities fraud and money laundering, and to cooperate with federal authorities by providing information against his former colleagues and associates, a cooperation agreement that secured him a significantly reduced sentence. And in 2003 Judge John Gleeson sentenced him to 42 months in federal prison and ordered him to pay $110.4 million in restitution to the 1,513 identified victims of his fraud. Belfort served 22 months at the Federal Correctional Institution in Taft, California, before being released in 2006, and the restitution order, which should in theory have provided meaningful compensation to those he had harmed, was honored so poorly that as of late 2018 Belfort had paid only approximately $12.8 million to his victims, with courts repeatedly having to take legal action to compel him to turn over income from his post-prison career as a motivational speaker and author. His court-ordered restitution obligation formally expired on April 28, 2026, by which point the court-appointed trustee had distributed a much lower total amount than the original order required to the identified victims, meaning that hundreds of ordinary Americans who had their savings taken from them by Jordan Belfort's scheme never received anything close to full restitution for what they lost. Number 6. Shimon Hayat, the Tinder swindler who built a romance empire on lies. The case of Shimon Yehuda Hayat, the Israeli national who operated across Europe between approximately 2017 and 2019 under the alias Simon Leviev, and who has become globally known as the Tinder swindler following the release of a 2022 Netflix documentary bearing that name, is one that illustrates with particular clarity how the combination of social media, dating applications, and the human desire for connection and love can be exploited by a sufficiently shameless and sufficiently practiced individual to extract enormous sums of money from people who have done nothing wrong except to trust someone who presented himself to them as a romantic partner. Heiress was born in Bnei Brak, Israel, and had a documented history of fraud and deception predating the Tinder scheme by several years, having been convicted of fraud in Finland under his real name before reinventing himself as Simon Leviev, a name chosen to suggest a family connection to Lev Leviev, a genuine and enormously wealthy Israeli diamond magnate whose family and company LLD Diamonds have no connection whatsoever to Heiress and who have stated publicly and emphatically that Heiress is a fraud who attempted to exploit their family name and reputation to deceive his victims. The scheme Heiress devised and executed with impressive operational sophistication involved matching with women on the dating application Tinder, presenting himself as a billionaire jet-setting diamond industry heir, taking his targets on extraordinarily impressive and expensive first dates that often included private jet travel and stays in luxury hotels, and then over a period of weeks or months of what appeared to the women involved to be a genuine romantic relationship, gradually maneuvering them into a position where they felt emotionally close enough to him and convinced enough of his identity and his resources that when he came to them with an urgent story about being in danger from his enemies in the diamond business and needing access to their credit cards or bank accounts so that his transactions would be untraceable, they agreed, because they were not simply giving money to a stranger but to someone they believed to be a wealthy, successful, caring partner who had chosen them specifically and who would, as he promised repeatedly, repay every penny as soon as the danger had passed, which it never did. Among the three women whose stories are told in the Netflix documentary, Norwegian Cecilie Schroeder-Fjelhøy is estimated to have gone into approximately $250,000 of debt to fund Heiress' lifestyle. Swedish Pernilla Sjöholm similarly found herself in profound financial difficulty, and Dutch woman Elaine Coleman, who ultimately turned the tables on Heiress by agreeing to help him sell his designer clothing and keeping the proceeds, was instrumental in providing his flight information to authorities, which led to his arrest in 2019. In total, investigators estimate that Heiress may have defrauded dozens of women across Europe out of a combined total of approximately $10 million between 2017 and 2019, with the actual number of victims believed to be far higher than those who came forward publicly, since many women who realized they had been deceived chose not to report what had happened to them out of embarrassment, or because they had little faith the legal system could help them. Heiress was arrested in Greece in 2019 after Coleman provided his flight information to police, was extradited to Israel, and was sentenced to 15 months in an Israeli prison on charges of theft, forgery, and fraud, but was released after serving only 5 months due to good behavior, a development that deeply distressed his victims, with Pernilla Sjöholm telling reporters that she was in shock at the decision and that Israel's justice system had failed the women he had deceived. The real LLD Diamonds company, the genuine Leviev family whose name Heiress had stolen to give himself credibility, responded to the Netflix documentary by filing a lawsuit against Heiress in a Tel Aviv court, with Chajit Leviev, daughter of Lev Leviev, stating publicly that Heiress is a fraud who stole the family's identity and has no affiliation with their company or their business. In September 2025, Shimon Heiress was arrested again, this time at Batumi Airport in the country of Georgia at Interpol's request, a development that his former victims Cecilie Fjelhøy and Pernilla Sjöholm responded to with cautious relief, with Fjelhøy telling reporters it was like a little celebration and Sjöholm stating directly that this man destroyed my life, words that capture in the most direct possible terms the human reality of what Heiress' years of systematic romantic deception had done to real women who had done nothing to deserve it. Number 7. Amanda Riley, the scamanda who faked cancer for 7 years. Amanda Christine Riley was, by all outward appearances, exactly the kind of person that a close-knit church community in the San Jose, California area would rally around without hesitation, a young wife, a mother of 2 children, a former elementary school principal, a person of faith who presented herself online beginning in 2012 as someone facing one of the most terrifying diagnoses that a young parent can receive, namely a diagnosis of stage 3 Hodgkin's lymphoma, a form of blood cancer that is treatable but serious, and she documented her supposed cancer journey with such extraordinary detail, such apparently raw emotional honesty, and such carefully constructed visual evidence on her blog and across social media platforms including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, that hundreds of people who knew her personally and many more who encountered her story online felt moved to support her with donations, gifts, prayers, and practical help, never for a single moment suspecting that the entire story of her illness, from the initial diagnosis through years of supposed treatment and multiple supposed relapses, was a complete and total fabrication from beginning to end. Riley had never been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. She had never received chemotherapy. She had never been the cancer patient she presented herself as being in the photographs she posted of herself in hospital beds, surrounded by medical equipment, with an 4 in her arm and a bald head that she had shaved herself specifically to make it appear that she was undergoing the kind of treatment that causes hair loss. She forged medical records. She forged physicians' letters and medical certifications. She persuaded members of her own family to support and reinforce her false claims in conversations with friends and community members. She created a website called supportamanda.com specifically to facilitate the collection of donations, and she encouraged her supporters to organize fundraising events, purchase Team Amanda merchandise, and contribute directly to help cover the supposed costs of her cancer treatment, none of which she was actually receiving. Over the 7 years between 2012 and 2019 during which the scheme ran, Riley collected donations from at least 349 individual donors and organizations totaling $105,513, money that federal prosecutors established she deposited into her personal bank accounts and spent on ordinary living expenses rather than on any medical treatment. Because there was no medical treatment. Because there was no cancer. The investigation that eventually exposed Riley's scheme was begun in part through the work of a journalist and blogger who had been following Riley's public cancer narrative, and who grew increasingly suspicious as inconsistencies accumulated over time, and who eventually contacted the San Jose Police Department's Financial Fraud Unit in September 2015, connecting with Detective Jose Martinez, who has since retired, and who has described the difficulty of investigating a case where the central claim that someone was lying about having cancer was almost impossible to prove given that medical records are protected under federal privacy law. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division eventually joined the case, and the combined investigative effort produced enough evidence to bring federal charges against Riley, who was charged with wire fraud in July 2020. On October 12, 2021, Amanda Christine Riley pleaded guilty in federal court to 1 count of wire fraud, admitting that she had falsely claimed to have Hodgkin's lymphoma and had used that false claim to solicit donations she was not entitled to, and on May 3, 2022, United States District Judge Beth Labson Freeman sentenced her to 60 months, 5 years in federal prison, and ordered her to pay restitution of $105,513 to her victims, noting in her sentencing statement that Riley's continued efforts to fake ailments even during her incarceration, having been taken by ambulance to an emergency room on 24 separate occasions during her first 18 months in custody at the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, meant that 60 months was the fair and proper sentence. The case became the subject of a popular 2023 investigative podcast called Scamanda, hosted by journalist Charlie Webster, and subsequently a 4-part documentary series on ABC and Hulu also titled Scamanda, which brought Riley's story to a national audience and prompted an outpouring of reaction from people who had donated to her campaign, many of whom described their feelings of profound betrayal, not just at having been financially deceived, but at having given their genuine emotional support, their prayers, their time, and their care to a person who was manipulating all of it as a performance. Number 8. Reed Slatkin, the Scientology minister who stole $600 million. Reed Elliott Slatkin was born on January 22, 1949, in Detroit, Michigan, and the arc of his life before the exposure of his crimes presented what appeared to be a story of genuine community involvement and financial success, as he was an ordained minister of the Church of Scientology who had built what many of his fellow church members believed to be an extraordinarily successful career as an investment advisor, operating what he described as an exclusive investment club out of his home in Santa Barbara, California, generating returns for his clients that appeared so consistently impressive and so reliably above market rates that the circle of people willing to trust him with their money grew steadily over the 15 years during which his scheme operated, reaching approximately 800 investors who collectively placed nearly $600 million under his management, the vast majority of them fellow Scientologists who trusted Slatkin not just as a financial professional, but as a member of their faith community, a person whose religious standing within an organization many of them regarded as central to their lives, gave him a layer of credibility and trustworthiness that went beyond anything a simple financial track record could have provided. Slatkin began soliciting investment funds from fellow Scientologists in the mid-1980s, initially operating out of his garage and presenting himself as a skilled stock and bond trader with a proprietary approach that consistently outperformed the market, and his reputation grew significantly in 1994 when he made an investment of $75,000 in a startup internet service provider called Earthlink, founded by fellow Scientologist Sky Dayton, and the extraordinary success of that investment, which grew Earthlink into one of the major internet companies of the early internet era, gave Slatkin's claims about his financial acumen a concrete and visible validation that attracted a wave of new, wealthier investors including Hollywood executives, entertainment industry figures, and prominent Scientologists who had heard about the Earthlink windfall and wanted access to whatever method had produced it. What those investors did not know was that Slatkin was not actually investing their money in any systematic or legitimate way, that the account statements he provided them were entirely fabricated, that the returns they believed they were receiving were simply being paid out of money deposited by newer investors in a classic Ponzi structure, and that the SEC, which had been alerted to concerns about his operation as early as 1999, was told by Slatkin when they first approached him that he was closing his business and returning funds to investors, a promise he had absolutely no intention of keeping. Among his victims were well-known figures including actors Joe Pantoliano and Archer and Giovanni Ribisi, film composer Mark Isham, television commentator Greta Van Susteren, and the founder of Earthlink Sky Dayton himself, but also less famous individuals whose losses were no less devastating, including a woman who had asked Slatkin to manage her savings at a moment when her husband was dying of cancer and the costs of his experimental medical treatment had nearly exhausted the family's financial resources, and who trusted Slatkin with that money because of his standing in their shared religious community, money that Slatkin took without hesitation. On May 11, 2001, FBI and IRS agents raided Slatkin's offices and home, and when investigators examined his records, they found a complete absence of any investment documentation that could support the account statements he had been providing to his clients, confirming what the SEC had suspected for years. In March 2002, Slatkin pleaded guilty to 15 felony charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice during the SEC investigation. And on September 2, 2003, United States District Judge Margaret M. Morrow sentenced him to 14 years in federal prison. Slatkin served 10 years of that sentence and was released in 2013, living for a period in a halfway house in Long Beach, California before his death from a heart attack on June 23, 2015, at the age of 66. Approximately half of the money he had taken from his clients, around $300 million, was paid back through the bankruptcy estate and recovery efforts, but the other half, representing the savings and investments of hundreds of people who had trusted a man they considered a spiritual as well as financial leader, was never recovered, and the Church of Scientology, which agreed to pay back $3.5 million to the bankruptcy estate as part of a settlement, faced ongoing questions about what it knew or should have known about the activities of one of its ordained ministers. Number 9. Victor Lustig, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower twice. Victor Lustig, whose real name according to records at Alcatraz prison was Robert Miller, was born in 1890 in the town of Hostin in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire and is now part of the Czech Republic. And from his earliest years he displayed the combination of extraordinary intelligence, natural charisma, and complete moral flexibility that would make him, in the considered opinion of law enforcement officials across multiple continents, one of the most accomplished confidants artists who had ever lived. A man who spoke 5 languages fluently, maintained at least 25 known aliases throughout his criminal career, was wanted by approximately 45 law enforcement agencies around the world at the height of his notoriety, and who carried out schemes of such breathtaking audacity that even experienced investigators who spent years pursuing him found it difficult not to experience a reluctant admiration for the sheer scale of his nerve. Lustig began his criminal career in the card rooms and gambling halls of Europe, where he proved himself a supremely gifted cheat capable of manipulating a deck of cards in ways that left his opponents completely unaware they were being systematically deceived. And from that foundation he expanded into confidence tricks of increasing ambition, traveling by ocean liner between Europe and the United States and using the wealthy passengers he encountered on those voyages as marks for elaborate investment and money-making schemes, including a device he called the Romanian box, a small wooden contraption he sold to credulous buyers with the claim that it could duplicate currency, a trick that worked through sleight of hand and the careful pre-loading of the box with real banknotes that would emerge on a delay, while the victim handed over large sums of money in the belief they were purchasing a machine that would make them unlimited wealth. In 1925, Lustig arrived in Paris and read a newspaper article noting that the Eiffel Tower, which had been built for the Paris World's Fair of 1889 and was originally intended to be dismantled but had been preserved because of its usefulness as a radio antenna, was now aging, expensive to maintain, and the subject of public discussion about its long-term future, and from that newspaper article Lustig devised what would become the most audacious confidence scheme of the 20th century. He had himself printed with fake government stationery, assumed the identity of a French government official, and invited 5 scrap metal dealers to an exclusive meeting at the Hôtel de Crillon, one of Paris's most prestigious hotels, where he presented them with what appeared to be a confidential briefing about the French government's secret plan to sell the Eiffel Tower for scrap metal, a sale that would require complete discretion and would be awarded to whichever dealer demonstrated both the financial capability and the trustworthiness to handle such a sensitive transaction. One of the dealers, a man named André Poisson, whose name translates from French as fish, was particularly eager to close the deal, and Lustig sealed his confidence by taking Poisson aside and, in an act of extraordinary psychological manipulation, confessing that he was actually an underpaid government official who depended on small unofficial payments from business dealings to supplement his modest salary, a confession that Poisson interpreted not as a warning sign but as confirmation that he was dealing with a legitimate insider, since the corruption of government officials was a widely understood reality in that era, and a straightforward corrupt transaction felt more believable than a sophisticated fraud. Poisson paid 70,000 gold francs, equivalent to roughly $250,000 in today's money, for the Eiffel Tower, and Lustig collected the payment and was on a train out of Paris within hours. What makes the story even more remarkable is what happened next, which is that Poisson was so embarrassed at having been deceived that he never reported the crime to the French police, which meant that Lustig, rather than fleeing to safety, returned to Paris a few months later and attempted the identical scheme again with a new set of scrap metal dealers, and while this second attempt did not produce a sale before Lustig apparently sensed it might be about to unravel and left Paris again. The mere fact that he tried it a second time captures something essential about the man's extraordinary confidence in his own abilities and his complete comfort with the risks he was taking. Lustig went on to engineer numerous other schemes across the United States, including a remarkable episode in which he convinced the notorious gangster Al Capone to give him $50,000 for a supposed investment scheme, kept the money for 2 months while doing nothing with it, then returned the full amount to Capone claiming the deal had fallen through, an act of audacity so complete that Capone, impressed by the apparent honesty, gave Lustig $5,000 as a tip. Lustig's ultimate downfall came when he masterminded a counterfeit banknote operation of such scale that it genuinely threatened to undermine confidence in the American currency, producing fake bills of such quality that they circulated widely before federal agents tracked them to their source. And in 1935, Secret Service agent Peter Rubano, who had spent years determined to bring Lustig to justice, finally succeeded in capturing him after a pursuit across multiple cities, and a judge in New York sentenced Lustig to 20 years at the federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, where he died on March 11, 1947 of pneumonia, having never expressed meaningful remorse for any of the deceptions he had carried out across 5 decades and dozens of countries. Number 10. Cassie Chadwick, the imposter who claimed to be Andrew Carnegie's daughter. The woman who would become known to history as Cassie Chadwick was born Elizabeth Bigley in the small Ontario town of Eastwood, Canada, sometime around 1857, and from her earliest years she demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for reinvention and a complete willingness to build her life on foundations of fiction, beginning with a teenage attempt to collect an inheritance from a fictional deceased relative using forged documents, an attempt that was caught and dismissed by authorities who apparently concluded she was too young and perhaps mentally unwell to be held fully accountable, a judgment that proved profoundly mistaken as Elizabeth Bigley grew into adulthood and developed the skills and the boldness to execute deceptions of genuinely spectacular scale. She moved through a series of identities across the northeastern United States and Canada in the years that followed, operating at various points as a fortune teller under the name Lydia Scott, as a supposed financial advisor under the name Madame Lydia de Vere, and through several marriages and aliases too numerous to fully catalog, accumulating along the way a conviction for forgery in 1889 that resulted in a 9.5-year sentence in the Ohio State Penitentiary, from which she was paroled after approximately 4 years, and from which she emerged not reformed but simply better equipped for her next attempt. By the late 1890s, she had married a respectable and genuinely wealthy Cleveland doctor named Leroy Chadwick and had installed herself as Mrs. Cassie Chadwick in a grand home on the stretch of Euclid Avenue in Cleveland known as Millionaire's Row. A social position that gave her access to exactly the kind of bankers, lawyers, and financial professionals she needed for what would become the greatest scheme of her life. The central mechanism of that scheme was strikingly simple in its conception, even as it was genuinely audacious in its execution. And it began with a visit to New York City in which Chadwick arranged for a prominent Cleveland lawyer named Dillon to accompany her to the Fifth Avenue mansion of Andrew Carnegie, at that time one of the wealthiest men in the world, the steel magnate who had built an empire valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars and who was known throughout the country as the embodiment of self-made American wealth. Chadwick had Dillon wait in their carriage outside Carnegie's home while she went inside, where in reality she spoke with nothing more significant than a household member of Carnegie's staff, then returned to the carriage and in the process of settling herself appeared to accidentally drop a promissory note bearing Andrew Carnegie's signature for the sum of $2 million. When Dillon retrieved the note and questioned her about it, Chadwick swore him to absolute secrecy before confiding what she presented as a deeply personal truth, that she was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, that Carnegie, whose conscience had never fully recovered from the circumstances of her birth, had provided her with this promissory note as part of a much larger arrangement under which she stood to inherit an enormous fortune upon his death. Dillon, as Chadwick had calculated precisely, was unable to keep this secret, and word spread rapidly through the banking community of Northern Ohio that Cassie Chadwick, the wife of the respected Dr. Leroy Chadwick, was Carnegie's secret daughter and was sitting on a fortune of promissory notes and inheritance rights that made her one of the most creditworthy individuals in the state, and banks that might otherwise have asked hard questions about collateral and repayment plans instead competed with one another for the privilege of extending her large loans at premium interest rates, assuming they were establishing a relationship with someone who would one day control a portion of one of America's greatest fortunes. For approximately 8 years between 1897 and 1904, Chadwick borrowed what historians estimate to be somewhere between $10 and $20 million from multiple Ohio banks, using Carnegie's forged signature and fabricated promissory notes as collateral and running what was in effect her own personal Ponzi structure in which the money from new loans was used to pay the interest on old ones, a system that worked as long as the banks continued to extend credit and asked no inconvenient questions. The scheme collapsed in late 1904 when a Boston creditor named Herbert Newton, to whom Chadwick owed approximately $240,000, lost patience with her delays and excuses and filed suit to collect the debt. And the news of that lawsuit triggered a cascade of concern among the Ohio banks that had lent her money, leading to a bank run on the Citizens National Bank of Oberlin, which had loaned Chadwick a significant portion of its assets, and which collapsed entirely as a direct result, wiping out the savings of ordinary depositors in Oberlin who had nothing to do with Chadwick's schemes and who had simply trusted their local bank with their money. Andrew Carnegie himself, deeply affronted by the use of his name and his reputation, attended Chadwick's trial in Cleveland, reportedly wishing to see with his own eyes the woman who had so successfully convinced the banking establishment of Ohio that she was his daughter, and Carnegie subsequently donated money to the citizens of Oberlin who had suffered losses because of Chadwick's fraud and funded the construction of a Carnegie Library building at Oberlin College whose coffers had been depleted by the scandal, a building that still stands today. Cassie Chadwick was convicted in March 1905 on charges of conspiracy to bankrupt the Citizens National Bank and conspiracy against the United States government, and was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison and a fine of $70,000, and she died behind bars on October 10, 1907, never having admitted guilt or acknowledged that she was not who she had claimed to be, and her death brought to a close the story of one of the most brazenly creative fraudsters in American history, a woman who operated more than a century before the age of background checks and digital verification, and who understood with extraordinary clarity that the most powerful tool available to a confidence artist is not any specific lie but the deep human desire of powerful people to believe they are dealing with someone even more powerful than themselves.